first of all, we must not confuse the ICC with the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, because they are holding hearings about whether Israel has committed war crimes. They've come to, they say Israel has a case to answer, but they haven't actually come to a conclusion. But the International Criminal Court is a different body, and we'll come on to the differences between the two in a moment with our guest. But the lead judge at the ICC, Karim Khan KC, who's British, said there were reasonable grounds to believe that both men bore criminal responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity from the day of Hamas's attack on Israel on the 7th of October onwards. Now, the Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, and the Hamas political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, along with the group's military chief, Mohammed Deif, are also wanted for arrest. Now, the latter two gentlemen are in Gaza. Their whereabouts unknown, but Ismail Haniyeh lives in Qatar, which is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court. Now, Britain is a signatory. Now, if these warrants for arrest are issued, they've been applied for, have been issued, if they are issued, then it means that if Netanyahu visits a country that is a signatory to the ICC, then that country's police authorities have an international duty to arrest him. And that could happen. It could happen if he visited Rishi Sunak. Think about that for a moment. Now, whatever the rights and wrongs of this are, you also have to ask the question, which a lot of people are asking tonight, including President Biden, is it right to equate the Israeli Democratic State with a terror organisation? I ask you that question. If I'm honest, when I heard this afternoon, I was thinking, well, that's quite a difficult one for me to offer an opinion on, because I have supported Israel right through this, or I've certainly supported the Israeli people. I've made enough comments or negative comments about Mr. Netanyahu for you who've been listening to the programme over the past 7 or 8 months to know that I'm no great fan of his. Do I think he's a war criminal? Do I think he should be indicted? I'm not sure I would go that far. But you may well have a different view. I'd love to hear from people in Israel. I'd love to hear from you if you are somebody who has been on... I mean, Andrew Marr had some really strong comments earlier on, and he said if you've been on these marches every Saturday in London and you've been chanting pro-Hamas comments, well, shame on you. And then he said also, and if you've been supporting Israel's actions in Gaza, which have resulted in tens of thousands of civilian deaths, then shame on you too. Words to that effect. Put it far more eloquently than I can. So this is, I think, a very, very serious day for Israel. But in addition, you do have to wonder whether this is not going to drive the Israeli right further into their bunker, their siege mentality bunker, which, I mean, you can understand why they're in it to a degree after the events of October the 7th. But I actually think this could rebound to Netanyahu's advantage in Israel, because he is fighting for his political life. And the longer these things go on, the longer he may think, well, I'm going to fight this. I will appeal to the Israeli people not to let things like this deflect them from the main task ahead of us, which is to eliminate Hamas. Again, people who know far more about Israeli politics than I do will have a view on that. 0345 6060 973. Well, I said to my producers earlier on, I said, let's not have a sort of pro-Israel and pro-Palestine debate with our guests. Let's get someone on who knows about the International Criminal Court and can give us an insight into what might be the effects of this judgment today. Well, Paul Garlick KC is with us. He's a criminal barrister who is also an international war crimes judge for the former Yugoslavia. Paul, very good evening to you.
Good evening, Ian.
Now, just tell us about the International Criminal Court to start off with, and how is it different from the International Court of Justice?
Well, you put it quite right here in your introduction. The International Court of Justice Well, first of all, they're both organs of the United Nations. That's the first thing. So they both have their jurisdiction granted by the United Nations. The International Court of Justice deals with the liability of states. So that's why the International Court of Justice is deciding what the conduct of the state of Israel is about at the moment. The International Criminal Court deals with the individual liability of persons for war crimes. So that's the fundamental distinction: state liability and the liability of individuals.
And you will have presumably read this judgment today, or the reasons that they've issued or what they've applied for the arrest warrants to be issued. What is their justification for going after the Israeli Prime Minister and Hamas leaders?
Well, I think it's actually very interesting when you read the actual application by the Office of the Prosecution, because Karim Khan is not actually a judge. You did say he was a judge. He's not. He's the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor. He's making an application to the court for these warrants, and the court have to review all the evidence. But when you look at what he actually said in his submissions to the court, I think it sums it up really nicely, because it's not really, this is not a nice subject, but it sums it up really well. Because it's a balance thing. And he said this because he's applying for warrants against, obviously, the Hamas leaders and Netanyahu. And he said this: today we once again underline that international law and the laws of armed conflict apply to all. No foot soldier, no commander, no civilian leader, no one can act with impunity. Nothing can justify willfully depriving human beings, including so many women and children, the basic necessities required for life. But then equally, nothing can justify the taking of hostages or the targeting of civilians. So this is what he's saying. And he went on to say, let's be clear. If we don't demonstrate our willingness to apply the law equally, that's to Hamas and the leaders of Israel, if we're seen to be applying the law selectively, we'll be creating the conditions for the law to collapse. And that's why I think this is actually very well balanced. And he's the prosecutor. It will be for the court to determine whether there is sufficient evidence to grant the warrants. But I think what he's done is right.
What will the timetable for this be?
I think now the court will act as soon as it possibly can. I would have thought we'll get a decision confirming this application within the next 2 to 3 months.
And if the arrest warrants are issued, what are the obligations on the 134 signatories to the International Criminal Court to make an arrest if either the Israeli Prime Minister or the Hamas leaders decide to visit those particular countries?
Well, it's an absolute obligation. It's an absolute obligation. And if any of the named people on the warrants did venture to the United Kingdom or to any member state of the International Criminal Court, they have an obligation to arrest them. But that only means they're arrested. They're then sent back to The Hague, which is the seat of the International Criminal Court, and then the International Criminal Court review the case again, because this is only the first stage, the arrest warrant. After the arrest warrant, the prosecutor then has to issue the indictment and to append to it all the evidence that he says is sufficient for the indictment.
And this can take years, can't it?
Well, it can take years. I mean, in some cases it's taken years. But I would have thought this is a case which is going to be expedited. It will certainly take a year, because obviously you've got to give the opportunity for the defence as well to prepare their case. So yes, it could take a year. It could take 2 years, and then that's only the first stage. But then you've got the trial.
Now, the United States is not a signatory to the ICC, but if Netanyahu decided to visit President Biden or President Trump a bit further down the line, possibly, could the FBI take action?
No, they have no jurisdiction at all. No, you've got to be. If you landed in a member state, so for example, if for some reason something went wrong with his plane and he landed in the UK, then he could be arrested. But no,
And I think Vladimir Putin was he indicted, or his arrest warrants have been issued for him in the last year or two?
He has not yet been indicted, but arrest warrants have been issued against him in a very similar circumstance to this case, yes. So if he touched down in Heathrow, he would be arrested as well. Yeah.
And what if Netanyahu came to Britain and he wasn't arrested? Would that mean that Britain would then effectively forfeit its membership of the ICC?
Well, we wouldn't forfeit our membership. It would be in breach of our international law obligations, which would make us the pariah of all the member states of the ICC. I don't think any government would countenance that.
So this would be a decision, presumably, for the Metropolitan Police Commissioner to make and implement.
Yes, it would, because the warrant is, if the warrants are issued, confirmed by the court, they're on the file. It's like an extradition warrant. It's very like extradition cases where a head of state visits the UK. If they touch down as an extradition warrant, the police have an obligation to arrest.
I always find it slightly amusing, if that's the right word, where people phone up my programme, particularly when we're talking about the Middle East, and say, well, of course, Tony Blair's a war criminal because of the actions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes. And I say to them, well, on what basis is he a war criminal? Because he has not been indicted by the ICC. He's faced no charges whatsoever and therefore has not been found guilty of anything. So it's not possible to call him a war criminal. But people are very blasé about the terminology that they use in these situations, aren't they?
Yes, it's an unfortunate misuse of the word, and it actually demeans the actual status of a war criminal. No one is branding either Netanyahu or anybody else as a war criminal yet. This is the first stage. It's the first stage to ensure that no one can act with impunity, because there has to be an investigation, which is what Karim Khan is doing now as the investigator, as the prosecutor. Then he hands over the case to the judges, to the judiciary, who then have to make the decision on all the evidence as to whether any war crimes have been proven beyond reasonable doubt.